For those of you who are joining us online, we're ready to begin. Let's open with a word of prayer. Holy God, we do thank you that we have the privilege of being alive at this moment in Earth's history. We have made the following statement over and over again. Everything that can be shaken will be shaken. But it seems to me, Lord, that today this statement is more applicable than ever before. I ask on behalf of the movement, and I'm sure everybody shares this sentiment as they pray with me, that each of us desires a clearer understanding of your word, so that each of us may remain faithful and true to you. In Jesus' name, Amen. So, for those of you who joined us this weekend, I'm sure you'll all agree that the 8 presentations that we had were, I don't know what words to describe them, but they were significant. As you review what was discussed, I hope that you can see a steady train of events that have occurred over the last 2 years. Particularly over the last 6 months. And I want us to all understand that the organisational changes that have occurred beginning at the Sunday law separate to the theological changes that we are going through, so not only have those organisational changes remained intact, but I hope that you see that that change has been the correct thing to do. There were many things that were taught this weekend, but I hope you'll realise that this is just the beginning of new thoughts and ideas. Some of them are not brand new, but I think the way they were delivered came as a shock to many people. So if I were to write that the personal or the individual experience has been replaced by an institutional one. And we can see that this is a theological issue related to the covenant relationship that each of us entered into with God. But when I referred a moment ago to the organizational changes that have occurred, and for the past several years, even before the Sunday law, in fact, when I've touched on subjects such as the priests, Levites, and Nethinims, and that even though the lines that describe them were correct, I'm going to write on the board no evangelism. But you'll remember that I've been saying for several years now that these Levites and Nethinims will not be joining the movement. I hope that you can take that very simple, basic idea and see how it was explained and described this weekend. When we consider the three angels, and we consider Elder Jeff and Elder Tess, and the third, long before the Sunday law, I've shared with the movement that the role that I have played in the work of this movement, both organizationally and theologically, has not been the same as these two people. They held a different role. And again, this weekend, I hope you can see that an explanation was given for this very simple idea which has been taught for a long time. This third point that I want to make, if you can't see it yet, I hope as the studies continue, you'll have a clearer understanding of this idea. Regarding the Sunday law, most people here believe that the Sunday law was July 18 during the election cycle of 2024. And I hope you all have been listening again for the past 2 years, and you will have seen that we have not given one, not two, but three independent proofs to demonstrate July 18. So you know that the first one, I'm just going to put Quintus, and then I'm going to put gatekeepers, and then I'm going to put adultery. So I think all of that is familiar to most of you, hopefully all of you. I've been saying for some time now that there is another proof coming, and this would in fact be the fourth proof. So what I'm saying, in agreement with what I've said in the recent past, if I were just to summarize this weekend study and call it the study of the covenant, then the story of the covenants is the fourth proof for the Sunday law. So now we have four independent proofs. You may not see the connection between what was taught this weekend demonstrating a proof of July 18, but I'm confident that in time you will be able to see the connection. I know many of us have lots of questions. We've received dozens of questions this weekend. I've collated them together, and I hope over the coming days and weeks that they will begin to get answered. If your question doesn't get addressed, please don't be offended or upset. Most of the questions deal with the subject of, or the issue, or the change, the subject issue or the change from an individual salvation to an institutional model. And we've received numerous questions regarding the second advent. Interestingly, Most of the questions about the second advent concern the issue of whether or not it will literally occur or if it will not be literal. Several years ago, there was a discussion in the movement about Bernie Sanders' version of heaven and our version of heaven. All the teachers that I was familiar with, that I spoke with at that time, laughed at the idea of the comparison between his version of utopia and ours. But that very question has again arisen within the movement. The speakers are aware that this is an important subject for you. But they may not address that subject, at least for the present time being. The waymark of the close of probation needs to be further explained and developed. But you will have heard the speakers tell you that beside the technical arguments concerning that waymark, why it's January the 3rd this year, and how to demonstrate that. Besides all of that, what's more important is this idea of mediation and institutions. Those are the subjects that we need to grapple with and come to a clearer understanding of. If you are struggling with these ideas, if you feel that your world has been turned upside down, you're not alone. You're in that situation, and so am I. Even though I've been grappling with these issues for some time now. What I do hope, and I know it is an experience that many of you have expressed, that these studies, this model, begins to explain many of your questions. So I want us to turn to Daniel 11, verse 41. So we're going to look at verse 41 and verse 42. We all know that these verses deal with the glorious land and Egypt. That has not changed really. We've been discussing what the glorious land is for some time now. We know that it's, broadly speaking, the USA. But since last year, even before that, we have begun to understand that that the term USA can represent different things. And I'm hoping that today, most of you are more comfortable than you were in the past in your understanding that the USA can represent different things. We know in verse 40, part B, that the USA is represented there under the symbol of horsemen, ships, and chariots. And we understand that it's represented in verse 40 as the glorious land. We know in verse 41, it begins with the pronoun he. And if we trace that pronoun, we in the movement, others may not, we come to the conclusion that the he in verse 41 is the king of the north. So we have chariots, horses or horsemen, and ships. It's taken from verse 40. And we have the king of the north, which is taken from verse 40. And then we have the glorious land. So I don't think it should come as a surprise to any of us that all of these are symbols of the USA. I'm hoping that we're all familiar with that now. Today, compared to if we went right back to the beginning of this movement, what's on the board at the moment is very different than what was originally taught. By Elder Jeff in the Time of the End magazine. The only thing that the things that he got correct would be 1 and 3, but not 2. But when those messages were given back in the early days, because of the difference or the separation of the king of the north to the glorious land. The way things were taught back then was that the chariots, horsemen, and ships in the glorious land were the same thing, because there was only one USA, and the king of the north was not the USA. So this is what was taught originally. It's only fairly recently, let's say after the Sunday Law, or beginning at the Sunday Law, that we had to confront this original model. So what I'm going to put here, because this is the original model, I'm going to change this and call this the papacy, and put a tick there. So that's what was originally taught. I think we all agree with that. If anyone has questions, I'm not sure how you're going to share it with me, but I'm willing to try to answer them. So that's the old version. And now we're going to discuss, I call it the present or the new. So in the new one, all of these are the USA. I'm going to call it USA 1, 2, and 3. Because these three USAs are different. And that's what the significant change that has happened from the past to the present. Now, maybe you could have worked all of this out from different Bible passages. But it seemed to me, and I might suggest that it seemed the same to others, that in order to show what these three USAs were, that we would need to understand Revelation 17. That we would need to understand the kings, or I call it the beasts, and the woman. I believe it's an understanding of what these two symbols are that has helped us to understand what these three USAs are. Now I know that everybody is not in agreement with this, and there's certainly no pressure to accept what I am teaching. For those of you who don't see things this way, you're confronted with a problem now, because the leading public teachers who have broadly accepted this model are now building the subject that was discussed this weekend and will continue to be discussed. They're building these new models based upon this premise. I'm not saying we're finished with Revelation 17, but the major elements of it we have set out, we have laid out. And I'm suggesting that a correct understanding of this woman and the beast leads us to an understanding of who these three USAs are. Just want to add in a third element that has been discussed in the past. And this was the subject of the last president. And 11 years ago now, it's been a long time, we used to teach that this was President Trump. And of course, in 2020, most people came to the conclusion that that study was erroneous, that it was wrong. Because we were forced to see that Trump was not the last president of the USA, because we still held to this original model of not understanding what these various USAs were. In 2024, we quickly realized that Trump was in fact Trump 1. So I'll put 2016 here so you know what I'm referring to. His first presidency. I'm not sure if we're all clear or if we're all in agreement. I'll say my current understanding. Is that that last president study was indeed correct. Which means in 2024, the Sunday law, that Trump 2 who is different to Trump 1 we have to ask ourselves, which one was the last? So I don't know how many of us remember that study, but if I were to use a slightly different word instead of last and call it the end of the world, that's kind of how we were describing it back then. And if I can just add, as we know it. So it's the end of the world as we know it, the known world. Even Elder Tess did studies on this subject. And we developed models based upon ancient history about the political struggle between Clinton and Trump. And when we see this term, the end of the world as we know it, what we were referring to was democracy. That democracy was under threat, that it was going to be destroyed. And replaced with something else. We could call it a dictatorship. So I'm saying all that was correct. So if that was true, if he was the last president of democracy as we know it, then what were we referring to back then? We've only realized quite recently, say recently, within the last 12 months, that this world that we're referring to is not Egypt, the world, but it's the glorious land world. And what we're referring to is this is the sixth kingdom, or we might call it the Lamb. So he was going to be the last president of that. Then we have another election in 2020, and this is going to be the end of his presidency. And we're all familiar with January the 6th and what occurs then. And when Biden wins the election, many of us believe that this last president study was erroneous. But what we've understood or what I've understood, is that that study was correct. And what this waymark, I put 2020, but I'll have to put 2021. What this is indicating, I'm going to put here the end of the 6th. And this waymark marks the beginning of the 7th. So you'll remember, I hope, that Curtis had been teaching for some time last year. There may have been others. But what was being taught was that these kings that are referred to in Revelation 17 even the beast, if you see the beast in 7 phases, or its 7 heads, that the kingdoms of Satan, these evil kingdoms, all start good. And this good is not fake. They're really good. And the idea of having these kingdoms as being good clearly challenges the idea that they're Satan's kingdoms. Because if they were Satan's kingdom, they would be pretending to be good. Once we understood this, as was discussed this weekend, we had to change our understanding of what these kingdoms were. That these are in fact the kingdoms of the world. All of them. Now I know that people have become so familiar with methodology, particularly one of them, particularly one of the methods, one of the rules. On the testimony of 2 things are established. But as I've indicated in past studies, I think people often either misunderstand and therefore misuse that rule. Because the fact is, you actually begin with one testimony. And you have to make sure that one works before you ever go to a second. Now we all know, if we go back to this word here, lamb, which I took from Revelation 13, I think it's verse 11. Yep. got confirmed, that this is a symbol of the USA. I think we all know that, which means it's good, which is what I've just said here, good. And that lamb is not a wolf in lamb's clothing. It's a real lamb. And therefore that means that lamb, which is the sixth kingdom of Revelation 17, has to be part of the fourth kingdom of Daniel 2. The Iron Kingdom of Daniel 2. I hope we can all acknowledge that truth. In the past, we would have casually taught I'm going to say taught incorrectly that the statue of Daniel 2 was a symbol of Satan's kingdom, in comparison to the mountain and the stone, which we would argue was God's kingdom. So if we quickly turn to Daniel 2, we could just turn to, say, Daniel 2:44. And we could see that that stone and the mountain that preceded it is the kingdom of heaven, or God's kingdom. So I'm not denying that. But if you were to read the passage carefully, I think what you would see is, we can go to, say, to verse 39. And it says in the last part of the verse, the earth. So I'm suggesting that the statue is a symbol of the kingdoms that are on the earth. And then what happens is that the kingdom of God, or heaven, destroys these kingdoms of the earth and takes over the earth. So I hope we're okay with that concept. Okay, so that's all I want to say about that. So we now view these kingdoms of Bible prophecy as kingdoms of the world, not Satan's kingdoms. We've been teaching that for quite some time. If you can see that, if you can accept that, what you can see is that what was taught this weekend isn't fundamentally different to this idea. In the past, So what I'm about to say is the same thing, but just viewed slightly differently. We're familiar with the word redemption. So I know it has a specific meaning, which essentially means to buy something back. But in the past, I've used that term of buying back to explain the development of humanity. That human society, not human individuals, individual humans have not changed over time. We're still the same creatures. There's been no improvement or development. But what has changed is how societies function. Now, Daniel 2 will show you that societies or nations have deteriorated. In many ways, people believe that the world is getting worse. But there is another perspective of this story. I hope one that we can all acknowledge, that humanity, I just called it society a moment ago, is getting better. The rules and laws that govern societies are improving. Maybe not from one year to the next. We understand what's going on in the glorious land. There appears to be a going backward, not moving forward. But this is only a transitory or temporary phenomena. Across the world, countries, societies are better today than they have been in the past. Our understanding of truth today is very different to the understanding of truth in the past. And when I say our or us, I don't mean the church. I don't mean this movement. I don't mean this movement. I mean humanity as a whole. We have more law and order today. We have a better understanding of right and wrong. The golden rule is implemented more today than it has ever been in human history. And all of this is occurring in the statue, not in the stone. We're talking about the statue. That's why, for some time now, we have looked at these kingdoms, this beast, as being the kingdoms of the world, not of Satan. I want us all to be clear on that. Because if you've grappled or struggled with what was taught this weekend, these thoughts and ideas about not the kingdom of Satan, but the kingdoms of the world, was this same idea in embryonic, in an embryonic model or an embryonic phase. There's no doubt that these kingdoms that begin good end up being bad. But that's another story. So, coming back to our board work, Trump 1 was the last president of the Sixth Kingdom. Which means the next king, call it the president, would therefore have to be the first of the next kingdom. And this has been the argument of making this the sixth and the seventh kingdoms. And that could only have been understood if you understand that the kingdoms of the world are good at their beginning. So the seventh kingdom begins good. And what the Sunday law waymark is showing us is the moment when the seventh kingdom becomes bad. And to understand how you get the seventh kingdom going from good to bad, is the story of July 18. Not the story of the November election. Unless you say that the November election is part of the whole cycle. To have an holistic story that goes from the beginning to the end, it explains the waymark properly, you have to have a singular story. And if you just isolate November 2024, and try to connect that to a complete story, it does not fit properly. I know there are people who don't agree with that. I know there are people who disagree. Those people who disagree with that, who make November the Sunday law, what you will see is that they will go from that event and they are forced to maintain or hold on to an idea that the third woe is the same entity as the first and second. If you were unsure about that a year ago, we now know, like we did some time ago about the priests, Levites, and Nethinims, that it was too late to bring them in. Whatever models we may have had, we knew that the time for their coming into the movement had passed. At least for the Levites, it was already too late. And so if it doesn't work for one of them, the whole model is wrong. So if you believe in November 2024, if you believe in November 2024 as the Sunday law, you will be forced, if you're going to hold a consistent model, to have the third woe as the east wind. Radical Islam. And I'm saying it's already too late for that to be true. Whether you go for December 2025 as a close of probation, or January 2026, don't be beguiled or deceived that there's only a month between them. There's a gulf between those two dates. Because what separates them is not a few days, it's different models. Just like what separated the Sunday law from July to November was not a few months. It's a completely different model. So, coming to our present model, we've described elements of the recent past and the present. But we know that the chariots, horsemen, and ships takes us back over 30 years. To pre-1989. The way I've described that USA, the USA that's brought in verse 40, that's pre-1989, maybe this isn't the best word to describe it, but I've said it's a nobody. Doesn't mean it's poor and weak. It just means that it's nobody prophetically significant. because the book of Revelation tells you that the only prophetic significant USAs that there are the Lamb and the Dragon. It's Revelation 13. And I'm saying that the USA that's described in verse 40 is neither of them. I'm saying that the United States that's described in verse 40 by this triple symbol of chariots, horsemen, and ships before 1989 is neither the Lamb nor the Dragon, but it is the United States. If I were to say it this way, it's a third symbol of the United States. Why that is significant is because it's not, at least that I can see, it's not described or identified in Revelation. Don't see it in chapter 13 or chapter 17. Which is why I've called it a nobody. So that's that one. The King of the North. I'm sure we all understand that there's a dichotomy or a confusion, if I were to say it that way, by the word king. Because the king of Daniel equals the woman of Revelation. The king that's described in the book of Daniel is not the king that's described in the book of Revelation 17. So I think we should all understand that. But sometimes we can forget. If that's true, and I believe that it is, that the king in Daniel is the woman in Revelation, then the king of the north that's described here, which is USA number 2, is the woman of Revelation. I'm going to put 17 here so we're all clear. It's not the only place that you find her, but we'll put her as 17. And then you get the third USA. And again, we've described and explained that in this graphic. That there is a lamb and there is a dragon. And my understanding is that this third USA is the lamb, Revelation 13, or the sixth kingdom, which again is Revelation 17. So we've had to understand Daniel 11, 41 and 42 in quite a radical new way. Based upon information that we have found in the spirit of prophecy and the Bible, and how we've had to understand and interpret those passages that we've read. So I'm going to get this graphic and I'm going to put it lower. So we have verse 41 and 42. Glorious land in Egypt. So what I want us to consider, and I know that most of us understand this, but some of us may not be fully settled into this idea. When we used to teach Daniel 11, and when we get to verse 41, we would say that the king of the north enters into the glorious land. And then we begin to see things going bad in the United States. So when we looked at what Ellen White would say, she would say that the Sunday law comes. She's not going to use Daniel 11, 40 to 41, 40 to 45 to explain any of this. She'll say, oh, it's very quiet to begin with, and then it goes from bad to worse. And often we would describe this as some escalation of trouble. And in many ways, she was vague about the history after verse 42. So I'm going to be forced to use these terms, Sunday law and close of probation, because we can't use 41 and 42, and we can't use glorious land in Egypt. So I'm going to be forced to use the Sunday law and the close of probation symbols or terms. When we speak about what Ellen White understood or taught. Because she won't map those two waymarks with verse 41 and verse 42. And she won't map them with the glorious land in Egypt. But she will tell us that national disaster, or what happens in the United States, spreads nation by nation until the whole world is taken. And then she speaks about what happens in the harvest. It's not new to us that she's going to speak about all these events in an apolitical way. So she's going to speak about it in a very religious way, particularly how it impacts us. That's why you get this very interesting perspective of what we call the harvest as being Jacob's time of trouble. So whether or not that you have read or seen in her writings, or in the Time of the End magazine, or in the thousands of studies that we have done over the last 30 years, I hope you can see it clearly today that when the King of the North enters into the glorious land at the Sunday law, verse 41, we're going to use the word finished. End. The glorious land, as we understand it, has ended. And what we then see that's occurring afterwards, let me try to put it this way. What happens, or what the captive USA looks like. I use the word captive instead of destroyed, but we could use the word destroyed. Once the United States is destroyed, the Lamb, in that 2-year history that comes afterwards, let's call it the new USA. This is what it looks like. The new USA looks like this. And this, all we need to go to is the media and read what the USA looks like over the last or the past 2 years. So, at the Sunday law, the glorious land is completely overtaken. It doesn't begin there, it ends there. Which means that before that, the USA is ending. So it's coming to its end before it comes to its end, and then it's dead. And what you see afterwards is the new USA. The 7th, or the dragon. If that's correct, then if I put here a similar arrow and say the King of the North enters Egypt, and if Egypt is verse 42 is the close of probation, then what are we saying about that? If we have a repeating pattern, I'm suggesting that we do, and everything that we have here would be repeated. So this would be finished. Or ended. And then this would be a new world. The world has ended here. And you can see in this period here, I'm not marking where it begins. The world is ending. So in this story, when we don't talk about Jacob, ourselves, but when we take this as a repeating pattern, what we see is once the king of the north takes the glorious land, it marks the end of that land. That kingdom is finished. And then what you see following is what that new, I call it country, that new country looks like. How it functions, how it operates. And if that's correct, then when you get to verse 42, and what's being taught now is that we have already arrived at that point. Is that Egypt is dead. Now, what we have not done is discuss how many Egypts there would be. Because if Egypt is the world, and we're past the close of probation, the world is still here. If Egypt is the world, and we've passed the close of probation, the world is still here. But if this repeating pattern is correct, then the Egypt that is here today is what I've said here, a new world or a new Egypt. What this is showing us, whether you take Alan White or Elder Jeff, is that we have had this model for a very long time. Maybe we haven't been very clear on it in our own mind. But the Sunday law history was showing us what the glorious land would look like under a new rulership. This would be the king of the north wielding supreme power. In the glorious land. At the same time, this same king is taking over the world or Egypt. By the time you get to the close of probation, Egypt is taken completely. Not only has he got control of Egypt, but he has destroyed it. It's no longer the same. And so what's happening afterwards in the period that we call the harvest is when the king of the north is at his zenith or ultimate power. But what you see is once he is riding high, having achieved everything that he desired, you get to verse 44 and things begin to rapidly go wrong. In verse 41, it doesn't tell you why. But if we are living through this history, you can begin to see that the decisions that begin to get taken after or from the close of probation afterwards they begin to, if I use the word backfire, which means to go against what you had planned. You thought that this plan would make you stronger, but it does the opposite. And the short way of explaining what I've just said in English is the word backfire. So, separate to all of this explanation, what I wanted to discuss today is that these thoughts and ideas, going from the individual to the institution, while it might sound radically new, it isn't. However, if you take these ideas and check and then confirm for yourselves that they are correct, besides what's going on in the world, the rise and fall of these nations, what's more significant for us, I think, I don't think it's just myself, is what these models are teaching us. I think you've already begun to see the implications of these thoughts and ideas. As the message develops, and I'm confident that it will develop very quickly, our whole understanding of the plan of salvation will change. It has to change if these thoughts and ideas are correct. One question that will continue to raise its head and I'm going to close with this thought. If these things mean what we're teaching, if these models are correct, question is, then why do I need to be in the movement? That question may not make sense to you yet, but as time moves on and this message develops, the question will make sense. If these thoughts and ideas are correct, what's the point in being in the movement? I hope each of us comes to a correct understanding or a correct answer to that question. But it's something that's going to confront us over and over again. I'm going to leave you with a Bible story. If I can find it. So I want to leave you with this parable. It's found in Matthew chapter 20. And it's verses 1 to 16. Let's close with prayer. Holy God, I want to thank you, as I said at the beginning of this study, for allowing me to be not only alive, but being here at this moment, in Earth's history. May each of us have a sense of what's happening, the great changes that are occurring in the great controversy, as the law and you come closer together, as we reflect you in a way that we haven't in the past. That this institution fulfills the role that you have given to it. In Jesus' name, Amen.